My name is Kim Barthel, and I'm an occupational therapist working with the company called Relationship Matters. I'm excited to have this conversation with my colleague, Nikki Smit. Nikki is an occupational therapist originally from South Africa, currently living in Singapore. She is the owner of a company called Project Play, where her mission is to come alongside children and families in an honoring way. She identifies as a neurodivergent occupational therapist with deep commitment to trauma-sensitive practice and neurodivergent affirming concepts. So I'm gonna just pass it to you to start.
Okay. So I think, there's so many things in my mind that I could speak to you about that we could spend, I think, multiple times connecting over. But when we met, one of the things that we kind of came up for us was this idea of neurodiversity and affirming practice and the language that we use around that, and why language matters. And I think that you always speak so beautifully about intention and how our intention matters. And I think, that's something that I almost want to start off with, is a beautiful place to start, because I think, as I have sort of, I call it, which I need to find a better phrase for, maybe, is stepping out of this neurodivergent closet myself as a professional, and even in my personal life, and being kind of more open about my experience and unmasking to an extent, as I've felt more comfortable and felt more brave, is really probably what it's about. My experience in kind of sharing that with people, it sometimes is met with, for the whole, it's been met with so much love and kindness, but sometimes it's met with defense. And I think in that, I really just want to invite people to be curious, and we don't have to get things perfectly right. We don't have to, I'm certainly not getting it perfect. But our intention matters. And that whole idea of people feel that before they even hear your words. And if we can be curious, I think that's really amazing.
Well, one confession that I have, I've been reflecting about this all day. And a comment that I have that maybe you can help me with is this. I feel like, reflectively, that my intention around those with difference has always been one of love. And one of the challenges that I've had in this shift of acuity is my fear of the impact not being received in the way that it's intended. So intention versus impact. And in some ways, I think that fear, for me personally, has made me more clumsy than before. That my and maybe that's true and maybe it isn't. But I remember all the way back to, I don't know, it must have been my first year out of university, and being working in a clinic, a child development clinic. And I remember this child who was just 2, who was diagnosed with autism. And I said, that is not my experience of this child, to the developmental pediatrician. I experience this child as connected, as available, as energetically with me, and I don't understand the diagnosis for this child. And I remember that bringing about a defense, of course, from, and this is all the way back in the 80s, of this, rigidity of diagnostic criteria. But I feel like my personal lens has been one of non-diagnostic for 40 years. And now that I'm so much more acutely attuned to, I think I'm getting fumbled at times with this, am I doing the right thing?
Yeah, I feel that. I feel you in that. And I think, you've gone straight into something that I was actually going to ask you about. It was one of my questions, was because if I think about what my dream or my kind of like hope for the future is, as I think of myself as a neurodivergent, neurodiversity advocate. And I always, we want to be present, and we also want to think about our hopes and visions for the future. And my hope, my dream is, I'll start with that and then I'll explain, is for us to actually move away from this idea of neurotypical versus neurodivergent, and to rather focus on neurodiversity, celebration of differences, because in reality, this like neuronormativity idea, like I actually think it's an illusion, because what is that? It's this, does anybody, kind of fall into that specific kind of very rigid ideal? No, we're all different. We all have challenges that we face. Now, in saying that, I am fully behind the neurodiversity movement and this like neuro-affirming paradigm, because I think for a very long time, there has been this lens of looking at neurodiversity through the lens of deficits and this like deficits-based model. But I think many therapists, and I imagine that's kind of what you're saying in yourself, you felt it in yourself, I feel like when I found out about this movement, I was like, oh my word, wow, this is what it's about. This is what I've been feeling in my heart this whole time. It didn't make sense to come into a clinic setting and be, oh, I'm going to fix this person. It didn't resonate with me. And I think, I'm based in Asia, so there is this very big focus in my environment on high achievement, on academics, on performance, on I mean, it isn't my culture, but I've lived here for many years, and I've worked here for a long time, so I do feel like it is my home at the moment. And so there has been this, and it didn't make sense to me to have that focus. And to be honest with you, Kim, there was a period where I felt perhaps OT is not the right fit for me. Perhaps maybe I don't want to be an OT, because it didn't resonate. And then in finding this kind of neuro-affirming movement, and don't want to make you uncomfortable, but in finding your work, I really have found, like there's this whole other way of doing things. There's this vision and this view and this lens that makes sense to me, and it resonates with what I feel like I've known intuitively the whole time, the things that drew me to this profession in the first place.
Whew. When I think about the idea of the potential of the future, where we might be in a place where this isn't even a conversation, where there's just a fluidity and a sense of equity in multiple realms. That is, in fact, an amazing dream, and things move quickly. And for me, what I would love is for, in this moment, to be a safety of dialogue. So that movement catches momentum, because you described, sometimes you're met with empathy and kindness, sometimes defensiveness. And I feel like many people don't want to have these conversations because of their fear of shame.
100%.
The perception of shame that what I say or how I think in this moment may be impacting you. And I've had this conversation so many times in the place of race. So in our country, our work with Indigenous folks, it's a very careful tread to be vulnerable enough to have these dialogues that are heartfelt, vulnerable, and sometimes make us uncomfortable in the cracks of our perception. So I've got a vulnerable one right now. When I interact with you, when I, just in the short times that I have had, I would not ever know that you have any neurodiversity in you. And I know that masking is so effortful. Can you speak to that for a moment? What that's like for you, and how can vulnerably we who don't yet understand be more supportive in that regard?
Wow, thank you for that question. I feel your love behind it, so thank you. So I am allistic, so I'm non-autistic, neurodivergent, and I have a whole salad of other neurodivergence diagnoses and then things that overlap, because as we know, and that's maybe something we can also talk about, there are so many overlaps, and so that is why I have, in terms of how I speak about myself, I identify most with the word neurodivergent because there's so many components to it. And I would describe myself as highly masking, and very anxious inside, which I think many people would never guess. And I think one of the parts of my neurodivergence is something called selective mutism, or I prefer the term situational mutism, because I think that selective implies that sounds like it's my selection, and it certainly is not my choice. And I think that's a really good example, because when someone looks at me talking right now, or indeed in any kind of context like this, they would never guess that there are times where I lose access to spoken language. And as a little girl, the way that would present was that if you put me, I'm also hypermobile, so I was a dancer, and so I would, dance a lot on stage, and I come from a very musical family, so there was a lot of music and performance and stuff, and you would put me on a stage and I would shine. But in the context of groups or with adults, I would lose access to my spoken language, and it made no sense. And at that time, there definitely was no talk about something like neurodivergence. And on the whole, I was very high achieving. I did pretty well at school, sometimes inconsistently so, but it didn't match. And so it was met. I recently interviewed my parents about some of the stuff. And it was so awesome to kind of get their insights into it. And even in that, they used both of them separately in separate interviews, used the words, "You just refused to speak. You just refused to speak." And we had rules, like you had to say hello or at least a wave, thank you, and goodbye. And, my mom actually said, if I knew what you've taught me in recent years, and if I knew what we knew now, who cares about those things, So I think, being high masking is met with like this confusion, because people think it's a choice, and they think that, well, I've either been met with, oh, it's a choice, or I've been met with I carry a lot around being oversensitive and over-identifying with things. And, perhaps it's not as bad as you might imply. And I think what people don't understand is I'm working really, really hard to, I guess, come across in this way and to do these things. And the funny thing, Kim, is that I also know a little bit that in the context of today and the way the world is right now, the changes that I want to see and the kind of voice I want to have on behalf of my community and for the people that I aim to serve, I have to mask a little bit. I have to mask because, that's where we're at. And so, but little by little, I am kind of stepping into that. And so, today I've got my little fidget here. I've got other little tools around me that people will see sometimes on my videos, releasing some of the eye contact, being honest and vulnerable about struggles and about, like doing something like running an Instagram page when you have executive functioning challenges is really interesting because, you like getting started is really hard for me. And being very aware of what people are going to think about what I have to say is a real challenge, but it's little by little. And yes, there are extreme mental health implications for masking that I don't think we even fully understand yet. Yeah, does that sort of...
When I listen, I feel the exhaustion.
There you go.
Of the effortfulness that comes with the learning and the metacognition, thinking about thinking. What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to say? Where am I supposed to look? It's exhausting.
Yeah. My wonderful partner, he is incredible, and he calls it rigorous self-analysis. And it is, yeah. Like, I feel like thank you for seeing that. That's very accurate. I do feel like I'm constantly evaluating myself and measuring measuring situations. And I think socially, that is so hard, because you are constantly wondering if what you did was okay for that person, because yeah. And I think that is, something we're only coming to understand now. So yeah.
You used the word allistic.
Yes.
That's a new one for me.
Really?
And so can you speak to that word?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if I can do it justice, but I can try. I think it is, it really comes out of respect for the autistic community. And I think identifying, as we say, we are in a time now where that matters, and speaking to the fact that when I share information, I want to be very clear that I'm not autistic. And so I'm not speaking on behalf of the autistic community. I'm speaking as a neurodivergent person, which I think carries value. And as someone who has supported the autistic community in my work. And so, I guess it's a way of making that differentiation. Where the word comes from, I can't remember. So
I think it's extremely valuable because too often the word neurodiversity and autistic are synonymous.
Yes.
And those of us who dig a little deeper into the language of neurodiversity know that it is an umbrella holding space, I guess is the best word I can say, for many co-occurring things. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that that is common knowing on the part of the public mind, that often those two terms, autism and neurodiversity, just feel synonymous in dialogue.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. And I think, again, there's been, and it's awesome, this amazing movement to help people understand more about autism. And I'm seeing more and more around ADHD as well now. But yeah, there's so many co-occurring, I don't want to say diagnoses, I suppose, or and what I've found really interesting is understanding more of the neurobiology behind, which I know makes you light up as well. Maybe you can speak a little bit to that. Like, that would be really amazing.
Well, I think that was a psychic moment you just had there, because I was just going to say, I'm remembering back to when I was at the National Institute of Mental Health, listening to Thomas Insel, who was the president of the organization at the time, talk about this without using the words we're using today. And this would have been 2014, maybe, in that time frame. And the new DSM-5 had just come out. And he stood up and said, I dare you, to a room of neurobiologists and researchers in the field of mental health. I dare you to do better than this, he said. I dare you to look beyond creating labels that are based on observations. And he said we could take all these different diagnoses and look at their brains, and they would have so many similarities.
Yes.
And we could look at their guts. We could look at their hormones. We could look at their context. We could look at their developmental trauma. We could look at all these different contextual factors that contribute to how people self-protect and how they adapt from a place of strength instead of deficit. So, here's the big boss who makes all the decision about money and mental health, inviting us in this direction. And this is why diagnoses are so difficult for me.
Yeah.
When I read all the prolific papers that I read about the brain and all these different labels, it's like a soup of why do I fit you into a slot? Because it doesn't explain the complexity of each individual.
Yeah.
Ever. And for me, occupational therapy, well, the mission of Relationship Matters is supporting the conscious evolution of the human spirit. And that helps people to become their best self, whatever that is for that person. And so often people say to me, what does it mean to become consciously evolving? And I say, it's to evolve to a place where I wasn't a moment ago.
Yeah.
In my awareness, in my consciousness. And so I'm having a conscious evolving conversation with you. And it requires openness and vulnerability and bravery and curiosity to expand our thoughts into new landscapes of how we might perceive things. So I think that the brain is a beautiful invitation to stop this idea of deficit thoughts and invite us into the genius of it, really.
Exciting.
You know, I'll never forget in Hong Kong, and now this conversation really helps it make even more meaning. And I've changed my language ever since. Was you came up in such grace and said something like, would you consider moving the word away from nonverbal to non-speaking? And, you know, in my landscape as a human is one that goes to you're a bad girl in a millisecond. You know, that feeling of the potential of creating hurt. And so that was my first thought, which lasted for a millisecond. Then my next thought was, of course. Of course. Of course. That's so logical. And I bring that up because when we reframe the language, which you and I spoke about, in many ways, we have lots of words we can reframe or choose different ways to explain. It's so easy to do once you know. And it resonates. It's just the unknown that keeps us stuck in the terminology that we learned.
Yeah.
So what would be some words that are important to you?
Well, first I want to say thank you for being open and for kind of your, first of all, sharing that that moment of feeling that, because I think that's going to help many people, you know, to move through that space as well, because I think we all have that response, and it keeps us, like you say, it keeps us stuck, and it holds us back from sharing these things, and it holds us back from trying, because I'd rather just not say anything because I might say the wrong thing. And I feel like I, for many years, didn't speak up about the stuff because I was scared I was going to say the wrong thing. And so, yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Nikki, one little poignant part right there is that when people hit shame, they do one of two things. They either make themselves bad and potentially shut down, or they dismiss the other.
Yes.
And both are from a place of in here, in my own being, of not good enough. And this, I know that being the recipient of a dismissive space is so painful. And it would also be helpful to remember that it came from a place in that person of touching their own feeling of not good enough. And that's not to excuse, but to find a place of meeting in this dialogue. You know, that compassion, which is really the antidote to this difficulty of separation, means that I have to have compassion for myself when I land in a place of discomfort.
Yeah. That's amazing. I'm going to listen to that again and again, because I think that is, something that I am learning, every day, to that idea of people do well when they can, and we're doing the best, like you always say, with what we have available to us. And so, yeah, that's really beautiful. And then the other side of it is also this idea of, why is that? I love that when you say that. Why is that activating for me? Why is that? Why do I feel like I need to defend myself and I have those moments as well. Like sometimes I'll hear myself say, well, as a neurodivergent person, and I'm like, why am I being defensive? And then I have to sit with it, and I have to, think about, why is that activating for me? Gosh, it's a lot of evolution.
I'm in the middle of writing a lecture for tomorrow, and it's about trauma in neurodiversity.
Can't wait.
And every time there's a feeling of exclusion, of dismissiveness, of lack of equity, of ableism, that's trauma.
Yeah.
And so when you ask, why is it activating? How could it not be?
Thank you. Yeah. I was listening to, I can't remember where it was, somewhere where you were speaking this last week. And one of the things that you said is, even in our tone, if your tone is even dismissive, even if your words are maybe not outrightly so dismissive, that you were talking in the context of the child, and how that like disconnects you from yourself, and how it teaches you that what you're feeling introspectively is not true. And that really it really resonated with me to think about that. Yeah.
So when we think about words like non-speaking, that was one that I will never forget, or co-occurring, or masking. These are important words. Co-occurring instead of comorbid. What a yucky word, comorbid, right? That these are shifts in mindset, but they are important. And why are they important?
I think they're important because they show your intent, your intent to not view someone as bad or wrong, or it's viewing someone as a difference in how different from what you're expecting them to be, or what the so-called gold standard is. So it's in that. One of the ones that has been a big shift for me in recent years, that I know is near to your heart as well, is the language around kind of like behavior, and challenging behavior or this idea of behavior of concern. And what I've tried to shift that to is what I've been saying is a response to dysregulation. How does that sound to you?
Well, I was just reading this article today that challenged me even more because it was written by a non-speaking adult on the spectrum. That's how they identified as autistic. And they said, my whole life I've been identified as having sensory processing challenges that have been identified as dysregulation. And this person wrote, I actually really love it in those spaces. And it really doesn't have anything to do with my need to regulate myself through my body. So this author said that my movements, my flapping, my rocking, the way I move through space has nothing to do with regulation. I actually really just like it. And I wish that people would stop perceiving me as having sensory needs. And I mean, I've been thinking about that for a long time. And, Manuel Casanova, what a great name, eh? Is a researcher in the field of autism brains. And he's been saying that for 25 years. Why do we see this as a sensory processing issue when it could be that the inner landscape of the experience that the person is having is just so pleasurable, like a glimmer, that it really has nothing to do with up or down regulation.
Wow. And shaking things up, Kim.
Shaking things up. And so sometimes we get it right, I think, in our detective work. And a lot of times I don't. And sometimes the things that we project onto our kids or onto adults, that we project as our interpretation, may morph over time, may begin with a neurochemical regulatory function, and then may not be that in the future. And so we continue. I just think so many of our clients are so patient with us. It's like, if they could hold up in a sign and say, oh, I wish you could get it. So, and Olga Bogdashina is another name that I love reading. And she's another neurodiverse-affirming advocate who has often talked about the sensory way that you OTs view neurodiversity is way too concrete.
Yeah. Oh, agreed.
That there's so much about integration and organization and rather than an energy and not just seeking and avoiding.
Yeah. And I would even take that a step further to think about, as OTs and as therapists or professionals in the space, why do we need to do that? Why do we need to do this kind of way of thinking with this particular lens or whatever? Is it because it validates us as the professional and the expert, and it like reassures us that we have a purpose sometimes? Maybe that's...
I think, Nikki, as a grandma aged person, that often you are divided. You must feel this too. You're divided in your mind. You have a parent or a teacher who comes to you with their suffering of having the experience that they're having with relationship to this child.
Yeah.
And then you have the child. And you're like, who's suffering? Who's suffering? Most of the time, it's really the parent or the or the teacher that should be in our care in that moment, in order for that child to just be their best self.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's often our biggest role, is the old word that we've often used is psychoeducation, helping other people understand. So, but the parent, who is often suspended in grief,
Love that phrase.
brings their loss to us in desperation for having something that they don't have. Often, not always, often. And so we, as clinicians, consciously and unconsciously pick that up.
Yeah.
As a piece of our work. And so many times I think our attempt to fix the child is to make the parent feel better.
Amazing. Thank you for giving me the language for that.
And how hard it is to say that. You know, when we were in Hong Kong, you heard a lot of voices talk about that, how the parent, the physician that was in the audience, how they shared, right, the struggle of, how do I let this child be and at the same time help them function in the world? And there's that reconciliation process between those two factors yet. How do I let my child be in the grocery store like this and hold on to myself as the adult? So I think it's the adults that we actually serve more than the kids. At least that's where I'm at these days.
Me too. How do you see that for clinicians? How can we evolve our approaches so that we better meet parents? Because I think, especially, I mean, I can speak from the context that I'm in, there is still, you know, I'm in a place where I'm really busy, and so I'm offering more and more of like a consultative type service, and I want to get to a place where I'm actually encouraging grown-ups to take me up on that, because I feel like that's the juiciness of what I do. And you know, if I can support you as a parent or you as a grown-up, then you're with your child all the time, you know, and it's that beauty of co-regulation, which, you know, we speak so beautifully about. So how any advice for us?
Well, I think it comes with confidence, actually. When you are a new grad, in the first, I don't know when the transition from new grad to mid grad is, I don't know. When you are new at this, there's a lot of doubt that I am of worth unless I meet that goal and objective on the IEP or on the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, right? That unless we, and you know, our system kind of feeds that, right? In many countries globally, you get paid based on that capacity, right? And so there, in a sense, our system sets us up to be afeared of not delivering to a parent or to a teacher what we say we can. And we've spent a lot of years trying to prove that we actually know and do something in occupational therapy.
Oh, yes.
And so I think it's this dial that shifts with time, that you start to know that it's not about what you do, but who you are when you show up with a family. That it goes from learning concrete skills to therapeutic use of self. That really becomes the art of what we do and part of the evidence-informed practice that we have. And so I think that it's not something that just happens. It's something that evolves. And then you have a parent in your practice, usually one, that you love, that is vulnerable and comes and sits on the mat with you or whatever, and shares their heart, and you start to learn. They ask the questions, they have it in them. And this is your favorite hour of the week. And you decide, this is how I want all my sessions to look.
Yeah.
And they invite you into this vulnerable dialogue. And then you get to go to another parent and you say, I had this experience this week with this mom who asked me this. And you should have seen what happened with their child. And then it just goes. Right? And we also learn not to take it personally. Eventually, maybe.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so, I think this is a good first dialogue. And that as time goes here, we have some more things we could talk about. Things like, I want to talk about flooding and anxiety and shutdown and environment, and there's many things on the list. And I hope that you feel like this was a good beginning for you as well.
Oh, Kim, my heart is so full, and I'm full of gratitude to you. So yeah, what an amazing conversation. And yes, I would love to stay in conversation with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.